Brethren, what is it that leads people to get off the track? There are many examples in the Scripture, and I want to call our attention to some today. We're told, of course, in 1 Corinthians by the Apostle Paul that the examples in the Old Testament are written down for us. They are illustrations. They are examples. And as we look back, I think certainly as we draw toward the end of our first year as a congregation here, as the global congregation here, that one of the things that we all have to think about sometimes is how do people get off the track? What is it that gets people off the track? And I want to call your attention to an example that we have, to several examples that we have here in the Scriptures that I think can point out some very vital lessons for all of us. We were talking last Sabbath, last Pentecost, last week, focusing in on the day of Pentecost and on the fact that Pentecost is the day of the celebration of the first fruits, and that the original Pentecost day was a time that where the covenant with Israel, the old covenant, was originally made on the day of Pentecost. Now, if we open our Bibles to Exodus chapter 23, let's notice we'll pick it up here in verse 20, and notice the instructions that God had given. You know, God had spoken the words of the Ten Commandments. When you went through in Exodus 19, God proposed the covenant to Israel. And in Exodus 20, the words of the Ten Commandments were spoken by God from Mount Sinai. And then the people said, "Oh, please don't let God speak to us anymore. You speak to us. We're scared." And so Moses went up to receive from God the statutes and the judgments recorded in Exodus 21, 22, and 23. And we have recorded here what God gave to Moses, which were the physical application, the civil application of the principles of the Ten Commandments. And notice the concluding words that God told Moses in Exodus 23, verse 20. "Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way, and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey him. Obey his voice, provoke him not, for he'll not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. And if you shall indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto your enemies and an adversary unto your adversaries. And my angels shall go before you and bring you in unto the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I'll cut them off. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do after their works, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break down their images." So he said, I don't want you compromising with what you see in the land. I don't want you bowing down and showing reverence and respect to their gods. I don't want you serving their gods and carrying out their rules and their rituals and their ceremonies. I don't want you following their example, their practice, their culture. I want you to overthrow that idolatry, to break up their images. You're to serve the eternal your God, and He'll bless your bread and your water and take away sickness from the midst of you. In verse 27, he says, I'll send my fear before you. In verse 28, I'll send hornets, drive out the Hittites and the Hivites and the Canaanites. Verse 29, I won't drive them out in 1 year, lest the land become desolate. See, the land would be empty all of a sudden, and wild animals would multiply before they settled it. But little by little will I drive them out from before you. In verse 31, I'll set your bounds from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the desert unto the river, for I'll deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. You shall not dwell in they shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. If you serve their gods, it shall surely be a snare to you. So they were warned right at the end of the statutes that there was not to be compromise with the religion of the land. That the people of the land and their religion and their practices would ensnare and entangle. Now notice in chapter 24, Then God said unto Moses, Come up unto the eternal, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship you afar off. And Moses alone shall come near the eternal. They shall not come near, neither shall the people go up with him. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and the people answered with one voice and said, All that the Lord has said we will do. Moses wrote the words of the Lord and rose up early in the morning, built an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes. He sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings. And Moses took half the blood, put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled upon the altar. He took the book of the covenant, and he read it in the audience of the people, and they said, All that the Lord has said we'll do. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people. And he said, Behold, the blood of the covenant. So here was the confirmation of the Old Covenant. Now you remember that the Old Covenant was a marriage covenant. The New Covenant is going to conclude with the wedding supper of the Lamb. We saw that last Sabbath, or last Sabbath. We focused in last weekend. Notice here, there was a supper. There was a banquet meal. There was, in that sense, a wedding supper, as it were. Verse 9, Then went up Moses and Aaron and Abihu, Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You see, that was 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes, which makes 72. Nadab and Abihu are singled out by name as Aaron's 2 oldest sons. They were 2 of the 6 elders from the tribe of Levi. So there were 6 elders from each of the tribes that together constituted this group that came to assemble here. And they saw, verse 10, they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of a sapphire stone, and it, as it were, the body of heaven in its clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also they saw God, and did eat and drink. So here was a banquet. They came up on Mount Sinai. You remember when God had spoken the words of the 10 Commandments, he told them to set boundaries around Mount Sinai, that not even an animal would touch against it, because if they did, they would die. God's presence was there on the mountain. And the top of the mountain was enshrouded in clouds, and there was fire and rumbling and flashes of light and fire that would shoot up, and it was a very impressive sight. And this great cloud sat down over much of the mountain. Moses would go up the mountain and disappear into the cloud and receive instructions from God and come back further down. And the people kept their distance there on the base of the mountain. And now Moses was told to assemble the leaders of the nation and bring them up. Now they didn't come all the way to the top of the mountain. They came up part way, disappeared into the cloud that covered much of the mountain. And as they came in there they could actually see all the way up, and there in the distance at the top of the mountain, they saw the throne of God. They saw this great expanse, this great sea of glass, as it were. And they saw the God of Israel, the one that became Jesus Christ of the New Testament, the one that was the spokesman, the one who spoke the words of the 10 Commandments. Because, we're told, you can prove that. I won't go back, but Jesus made it very clear in the book of John that it was not the Father whose voice had ever been heard or whose shape had been seen, but that Christ is the one who came to declare or to reveal the Father. And that was made very clear. So here we find that they did see the God of Israel, and they took part of this banquet as it was spread there on the side of the mountain, and they could look up and actually see this great expanse, a tremendously impressive sight. This sight is recorded in other places. You know, in the book of Ezekiel, it talks about in Ezekiel 1 the vision that Ezekiel had, and how he saw in Ezekiel 1 and verse 4 this whirlwind coming out of the north, and this great cloud, and all the flashes of fire and lightning and the brightness, and it's just an incredible sight. And when it finally came, he was able to look up in verse 26 of Ezekiel 1, and he saw this expanse over their heads. And he saw there on this expanse the likeness of a throne, and he saw the appearance. It had the appearance of a sapphire stone. That's what, of course, we read back here in Exodus 24:10. You know, like a translucent sapphire stone is what he saw. And Ezekiel 1:26 describes the same thing. The appearance of the sapphire stone, and upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness as the appearance of a man above upon it. And this was, in verse 28, he saw this tremendously beautiful rainbow, and the brightness all around, this dazzling light. In verse 28 of Ezekiel 1, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Now you can go through and read it in other places. You read where John saw something similar in Revelation. So here was a revelation of God here to the elders of Israel. They took part in a banquet which was in reality a wedding banquet, because God was married to Israel. It was a marriage covenant. Now, in verse 12, the Lord said to Moses, "Come up here to me in the mount, and I'll give you tables of stone and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them." And Moses rose up together with Joshua, and Moses went up unto the mount of the Lord, the mount of God. And he told the elders to wait here for a little while until we come again to you. And Aaron and Hur are here with you. So Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days, and the seventh day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And in the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud, got up into the mountain. He was in the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. A tremendously impressive sight. Here was a mountain, and all of this fire and this brightness that was shining from the top, this great cloud that enveloped so much of the mountain, and the people could look up and they saw this great shooting fire as though it were a volcano that were ready to erupt. Only lava wasn't coming down the sides. And they kept seeing these flashes of brightness and brilliance and fire. And the mountain would quake and rumble. This deep thundering from within the mountain. And they were greatly impressed. Here were the leaders that were actually up there and had been given this vision of God on His throne. And they had seen it. They had heard the voice of God giving the 10 Commandments. Well, Moses was in the mountain, and God began to give him instructions in chapter 25. And he said in verse 8 of chapter 25, "Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them." If you want to know the fundamental difference between the Old Testament church and the New Testament church, it's right here. God said, "Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them." Now you can go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16. Here's what we're told about the New Testament church. Know you not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? You are the temple of God. The Spirit of God dwells in you. If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. In the New Testament church, we are the temple of God's Holy Spirit. We are the temple of God, and God dwells in us. Under the Old Testament church, God dwelt among the people. There was a sanctuary in the midst, and God dwelt among them. There was a holy place that symbolized the presence of God. God dwelt among Old Testament Israel. He dwells within the New Testament church. He told Moses in chapter 25 and verse 9, according to all that I show you after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of the instruments, you're to make it. Now you could go back to Hebrews 8 and 9 and 10, and you can go through and study the fact that this pattern of the physical implements of the tabernacle prefigured various things, various parts of God's plan in terms of spiritual aspects. He goes through and he talks about the mercy seat, and he talks about the Ark of the Covenant and the table of showbread and the 7 lamps in chapter 25. And in chapter 26 he talks about building the tabernacle, and he talks about the veil dividing the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And in chapter 27 he talks about how to transport the tabernacle. And in chapter 28, making holy garments for Aaron and setting him apart as a priest. And in chapter 29, there were instructions concerning the setting apart of Aaron and his sons and their consecration as a priesthood. And God said, on down in chapter 29 and verse 44, and I will sanctify the tabernacle of the congregation and the altar. I will sanctify also both Aaron and his sons to minister to me in the priest's office, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will be their God. They shall know that I am the eternal their God that brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, that I may dwell among them. I am the eternal their God. Describes here in chapter 30 the altar to burn incense and the specific instructions on that. Chapter 31 discusses the construction of certain of these things. And the latter part of the chapter, the special Sabbath covenant. And we find in verse 18 of chapter 31, the end of chapter 31, he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. Now, chapter 32 tells us that when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mountain, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. Now notice what happened. Here, just a matter of weeks earlier, the people had seen and heard God give the 10 Commandments. They had seen all of these impressive signs that had occurred at the giving of the law. The covenant had been made. The people said, all that the Lord has said we will do. The elders of the nation, the leaders, went up into the mountain, actually went up on the mountain, part way up, and enjoyed this great banquet feast where they could actually look up and see God on top of the mountain. See the very throne of God, the expanse of this great crystalline sea of glass spread out there, looking like a brilliant translucent sapphire stone with a likeness of a throne and a man upon that throne, and all this brightness and brilliance and glory and lightning flashing and all of these tremendous things. They had actually been there. They had seen it. They came down the mountain. Moses went on up, disappeared into the cloud. And here they were at the base of the mountain. And the time went by. Time went by. Days went by. Weeks went by. The people began to get restless. And they said, we don't know what's happened to Moses. We don't know exactly where he went. He disappeared into that cloud and weeks have gone by. And he may never come back down again. Moses had gone up to get the instructions from God of exactly how God was to be worshipped. But you see, the people had some ideas of their own. They remembered the good times they had had with religion in Egypt. They remembered various of the customs and the traditions. And they remembered that the Egyptians always had these objects that they worshipped. A golden calf or a golden bull. And they said, that's what we need us. We need something familiar to help us worship the God of Israel. Notice that the people didn't say, we're going to depart from God. They didn't say, look, let's depart from God and let's go and break the commandments. They said in chapter 5, Aaron saw it, he built an altar, made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the eternal. A feast to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Well, we're going to worship God. We're just going to, well, we've come up with these ideas and we think that God will be pleased with that. And so, we find that they rose up early on the morrow, offered burnt offerings, brought peace offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. Now, you don't have to get very far down the chapter before you find they weren't playing tiddlywinks. They weren't having a softball game or anything of the sort. They started out and they said, well, we need to worship God, so we need something that reminds us of God. So we'll build this golden bull. And we'll offer sacrifices. And they remembered the way those things were done in Egypt, and so they sat down to eat and drink. They rose up to play, and they were pretty well. They had done as the festivity wore on. They may have done some eating, but they obviously did plenty of drinking, because as we come on down a little bit later here, we find that as they came down, that God told Moses, get you down. This people have corrupted themselves. And in verse 7, of chapter 32, the Lord said unto Moses, get you down. Your people, which you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. God didn't really want to claim them at that point. You ever notice in a family how kid does something and say, guess what your son did? Guess what your daughter did? Well, God said to Moses, guess what your people did? This people that you brought out of Egypt. They've corrupted themselves. And Moses pleaded with God and said, it can't be that bad. Please forgive them. And then they came on down a little ways, and when Moses saw it, he forgot about begging for mercy, and we find that his anger waxed hot in verse 19. But notice as they were coming on down in verse 17, Moses in verse 15 turned and went down the mountain. And he had the two tables of the testimony were in his hands. The tables were written on both their sides. On the one side and on the other were they written. They were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God graven upon the tables. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said unto Moses, there was a noise of war in the camp. They didn't get very far down the mountain before Joshua said, listen to all that. There must be a war going on. He could hear all this clanging of metal and these shouts and all this noise. All he could hear was a din. And they got a little further down, and he said, it's not the voice of them that shout for the mastery, neither is it the voice of them that cry for being overcome. The noise of them that sing do I hear. So they came to pass, they came near to the camp, saw the calf and the dancing. Oh, they were having a party. Now, it sounded like a real rock fest as they were coming on down. You had all this noise and clanging and all this loud, reverberating noise that was banging around and all this clanging of metal and shouting and shrieking. Joshua thought there was somebody being killed down there. It sounded like a war was going on. When he got down closer, they're having a party. They're singing and dancing. In fact, verse 25, when Moses saw that the people were naked. Now, when it said they sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play, as I said, they weren't simply playing volleyball. The party had gotten seriously out of hand. It was a pagan orgy, just like they remembered from the good old days in Egypt. The people began to drink and to become intoxicated, and the party got wilder and wilder and wilder. The music got louder and wilder, and the liquor flowed, and things were totally out of hand. How did something like this happen? How did it occur? How had they corrupted themselves so completely in such a short time? Well, obviously, those who participated in it, those who were the instigators, had fond memories of Egypt. Oh, they didn't have fond memories of the problems, but they had good memories and good feelings about the religious festivals of Egypt and all of the things that pertain to that. And left to their own devices for a while, they recreated religious worship the way they remembered it from Egypt. And of course, what did most people do? You had those who instigated it. You had a weak leader who caved in and yielded to the pressures. And you had people who went along because that's what was going on. That's what was happening. And we find a very serious problem. And you find in verse 35, the Eternal plagued the people because they made the calf which Aaron made. So the people were plagued because of what they had done. Now we can go on down through the story and we find that God told Moses to come back up the mountain, and you can go through the remainder of the details where the instructions were given for the building of the tabernacle and all of the things pertaining to it, and the people now were all sorry and they were ready to build the tabernacle. And so finally in chapter 40 the tabernacle is erected, and we find that in verse 38 of chapter 40 that the cloud of the Lord was upon the tabernacle by day and the fire on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. So here we find an example of the people corrupting themselves and getting seriously off the track. We find that there was a major problem in the leadership, in this case a weak leadership, and a people, and there were obviously leaders among the people. There were those who were greatly attracted to the religion of Egypt. They wanted to worship God the way they saw fit. Well, as we come into the book of Leviticus, we have the instructions about the various sacrifices and all the details of that. And in chapter 8 of Leviticus, we have the instructions for consecrating Aaron and his sons as the priesthood. And in chapter 9, the details of this consecration of Aaron and his sons being set apart as priests. And they came out and they slaughtered the animals and put all of this, the sacrifices on top of the altar. And in chapter 9, verse 23 of Leviticus, Aaron and Moses went into the tabernacle of the congregation, came out, blessed the people. The glory of the Lord appeared upon all the people, and there came a fire out from before the Lord, and consumed upon the altar, and burnt the burnt offering and the fat. The people saw it, and they shouted and fell on their face. So God actually ignited the sacrifice. He ignited the fuel there in there under the altar, and this tremendous blaze went up and this burnt offering. Now God had given instructions concerning the altar and concerning the way that He was to be worshipped. God wanted to be worshipped as He revealed it. And He'd given specific instructions. There was the altar of sacrifice, and it was a great, huge construction there. It was this, in a sense, a box. It had a firebox underneath it and a grate on top. You could compare it in some ways to a barbecue pit, because that is an oversimplification, but that was the principle of the thing. You had wood that came in underneath that was burned, and there were coals, and the part that was burned for God, the fat and the entrails and the things that were placed there on the altar were placed on this grate. And of course, what happens? Well, when you know what happens is the heat begins to as it begins to get hot, and the fat begins to drip down. All of a sudden, you've got this great roaring blaze that literally consumes everything on the altar. And the fat, because the fat was piled up there, that is dripping down on these hot coals. You've got this great roaring blaze that consumes the whole thing. Now, before the burnt offering was ignited, there were coals that were to be taken out from the firebox underneath the altar. Coals to be taken out and put in a little implement called the golden censer. It was just a little pan that was suspended that had live coals put in it, and then they took it into the holy place, and the incense was put on it, and it was put into the altar of incense. The fire that caused the incense to burn was taken from the altar. Obviously, you had to do it in the right way. There was a specific timing on it. You couldn't be careless. What would happen if you waited too long? Well, you had a great roaring blaze on the altar of burnt sacrifice, and you couldn't even get close to the thing, much less start getting coals out. Now, with that setting the stage, we come into chapter 10 and verse 1. Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron. We noticed them earlier, They were mentioned by name as going up into the mountain. Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer and put fire therein and put incense thereon and offered strange fire before the Eternal, which He commanded them not. It was not fire that originated with this divine miracle of beginning this process. Everything was to be lit from the altar of sacrifice. See, the coals there from that were to light everything else. God miraculously started that fire. And so that's where the coals were to be taken from, and it was a continuation that everything else was to be lit off of that. Well, they had evidently been careless and had gotten the morning sacrifice ignited in a great roaring blaze and couldn't get the coals out, and so they went and got some somewhere else. Got somebody's campfire coals or whatever it was. They offered strange fire before the Lord, which He commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Eternal and devoured them, and they died before the Eternal. Fell down dead right there in the Holy of Holies, in the holy place. Sort of like something out of Raiders of the Lost Ark, if you, that's where some of that came from. And Moses said unto Aaron, This is that the Lord spoke, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come near me, and before all the people will I be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. And 2 cousins were called in to bring the bodies out and to take them outside the camp. And we are told, Aaron was instructed in verse 7, and the rest of his sons not to go out of the door of the tabernacle. And notice here in verse 8, the Lord spoke unto Aaron, saying, Do not drink wine nor strong drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of the congregation, lest you die. Now that's a pretty good indication of exactly what had happened. Nadab and Abihu had been drinking. They were profane individuals who treated God's instructions carelessly. They had been drinking and were not showing reverence to God. You see, God said in verse 3, Moses told Aaron that God said, I will be sanctified in them that come near unto me. Those who are going to come into my presence are to show respect and reverence. I am to be reverenced by those who come near unto me. It is a matter of showing respect unto God. Here were a couple of individuals in high position who were profane individuals, careless individuals. Individuals who were drinking and were not paying attention to what they were doing. They were not showing reverence to God. Their drinking had made them careless. They just took a very careless and casual approach to the service of God. And God said, I will be sanctified in those that come near unto me. And these individuals were struck dead because of their carelessness. It was a matter that God was showing. It's not that every time anybody has ever done anything out of line, God has struck them dead. But here was the first time, and God set an example. He made it plain that a careless, lackadaisical, disrespectful attitude toward God and toward His service is a serious matter. That's why it's important, and we need to understand this principle even we come before God on the Sabbath. We come to Sabbath services. The Sabbath, we're told, is a holy convocation. We come to appear before God in the place where He has set His name. And if we understand that principle, then we realize that we are showing respect and reverence to God in the way that we present Himself, and the way that we present ourselves, and the way that we conduct ourselves. And that ought to reflect itself in everything from our dress to our conduct. That we are doing so to show respect to God, and showing respect and honor to the great God before whom we're coming. Nadab and Abihu were not showing respect to God, even though God had shown them great things. They corrupted themselves because they had a careless, profane attitude. Not an attitude of deep reverence and profound respect for God. They were self-centered. They were profane in their conduct and in their attitude. Careless in the carrying out of their duties. So we see that corruption can come as a result of people who are attracted to the old ways of the world. People who are fascinated and enticed by Egypt, are fascinated and enticed by all of the various Canaanite variations. That's what happened back in Exodus 32. The people were enticed and attracted to the old familiar paganism. And once that was instigated, the combination of that attraction and allure of the old familiar paganism together with weak leadership, resulted in the people corrupted themselves. The combination here of an attitude of careless, profane individuals resulted in a very sobering event. God actually striking these two individuals dead. Now let's come on over into the book of Judges, and I want to pick up a different account, again involving the priests. Here we're looking at examples involving the priesthood. We saw an example involving Aaron and what he allowed to get out of hand and the terrible results that occurred. And you have to understand that the people that followed those things died in Exodus 32. They died. Here, Nadab and Abihu did. Now, in Judges chapter 17, we'll pick up the story in verse 1. There was a man of Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah. Now, Micah was not a man of very good character. In fact, he had stolen some money from his mother. He had stolen 1,100 shekels of silver. A man that steals from his mother is not someone that we usually look up to a whole lot. And Micah had stolen this money, and his mother didn't know what had happened to it, but she was really upset. And she had looked for it, and she couldn't find it, and she had pronounced a curse on whoever got it, and Micah began to get scared. And so he came in and he said, that money, this 1,100 shekels, about which you cursed and spoke of in my ears, the silver is with me. I took it. Well, he restored the silver and shekels to his mother, and his mother was delighted to get it back, and she wasn't mad at him. Obviously, he was her fair-haired boy, and whatever he did was all right, which is probably the reason that he had this sort of an attitude. If he wanted something, he took it, sort of in a sneaky way. So he had gotten scared, and he gave it back to her, and she said, look, you know why I wanted this money back? Verse 3, I had wholly dedicated the silver unto the Lord. Oh, very religious woman. I dedicated the silver unto the Lord from my hand for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. Now, get that. She dedicated the silver to God to make a little idol. You see, she worshiped God, but she worshiped God the way she thought God ought to be worshipped, not the way God said to worship Him. She didn't see where she thought these little images that the Canaanites used, why those looked nice, and that was pretty, and those were nice religious symbols, and she thought that'd be good to use for God, for the God of Israel. And so she dedicated this silver to God. She was going to have a little image made. And so he restored the money to his mother, and his mother took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to the pounder. They had to go down to this fellow to actually make their gods. So he took, the rest of it, melted it down, and she paid him this money, and he made their gods. That ought to make somebody stop and think. If you've got to go down and pay somebody to make your God for you to worship, that ought to sort of ring a bell that something's wrong, but it didn't. So they made these the graven image and the molten image, and they were, end of verse 4, in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a house of gods, and he made an ephod and a teraphim, and consecrated one of his sons to become a priest. So Micah decided that he really got religion. He built a little shrine, a little building out here by his house, and he put these little images up, these little idols, and he had really gotten religion. And he took one of his sons and he said, "Now, son, you're going to be a priest. I'm going to make you a priest, and now God's really going to bless me because I'm going to really be a religious fellow. I've got all these little things out here, and You drive by and you see people that have little shrines out in front of their house, and they've got these little, theirs are usually made of plaster, but if you look on the inside, sometimes you see things of gold and silver hanging on the walls. But Micah had this little shrine built out here and made his son a priest. And in verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So they just worshiped God the way that seemed like a good idea to them. Now there was a young man out of Bethlehem, Judah, who was a Levite. And he lived up there in Bethlehem. In verse 8, the man departed out of the city from Bethlehem, Judah, to sojourn where he could find a place. And he came to Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he journeyed. He stopped by there and spent the night. And Micah said, where are you coming from? And he said, well, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem, Judah, and I'm looking for a place. I'm traveling, and I'm looking for a place. And Micah said unto him, have I got a deal for you? You just dwell right here. You have found it. You be unto me a father and a priest. And I'll pay you 10 shekels of silver every year, and I'll give you clothes and feed you. And the Levite went in. And he was content to dwell with the man. And the young man was unto him as one of his sons. And was in the house of Micah. And then said Micah, verse 13, now I know that the Lord will do me good, because I've got a Levite for my priest. He knew that he was really in good shape now. He had a Levite. Before, he was just doing the best he could. He made one of his sons priest. Now he said, son, look, you can go back to farming because I've got a real, genuine A1 priest. I've got a real Levite. He's going to be our priest. So he told Micah, what doctrines he needed to preach and what he needed to do, and offered him a salary. And Micah said, yeah, salary and the benefits look pretty good. I think God is calling me here to be your priest. Now in those days there was no king in Israel, and the tribes of the Danites sought an inheritance to dwell in. This actually chapter 17, 18 that we're going through in chronological order really go back to the very beginning of Judges. There is a sequence going through with the story of the Judges, then when you come to chapter 17, you come into a historical inset that really goes back to before this succession of Judges, and right at the very beginning. And the Danites had not yet received their inheritance. The land had not been fully allocated, and they were looking for a place. They were looking for their inheritance. And in verse 2, the children of Dan had sent of their family 5 men from their coast, men of valor, to spy out the land and to search it. And they said to them, go search the land. And when they came here to this area, they got to Mount Ephraim, and they came here to the house of Micah, and they spent the night. And when they were by the house of Micah, they knew the voice of the young man, the Levite. They heard this voice, and they said, I know that guy. I've heard him. And so they said unto him, what are you doing here? Who brought you here? And what are you doing here? And he said in verse 4, well, thus and thus deals Micah with me, and he's hired me, and I'm his priest. Yeah, he says, boy, I found a church. I'm here, and I'm preaching, and I got all this stuff, and Micah's paying me. He's giving me 10 shekels a year, and a suit of clothes, and all the food I can eat, and this place to live, and I've got this little, and he's hired me. I'm his priest. He said, oh, you're a priest, huh? Well, ask counsel, we pray you, of God, that we may know whether the way that we go is prosperous. And the priest said, oh, yeah, go in peace. The Lord, the Lord will lead you, and everything's going to be fine. So, anyway, the 5 men departed, and they came to Laish, and they saw the people that were therein, and how that they were there and were a trading people, but there was no real leadership, no magistrate there that And so, anyway, they came back to their brethren and gave a report on the land and the fact that they thought that they could overtake Laish and conquer the city. And so in verse 11, there went from the family of the Danites 600 men appointed with weapons of war. And they went up. And verse 13, they passed near Mount Ephraim, and they came to the house of Micah. And the 5 men that went to spy out the land said there to the soldiers, they were camped there. You see, evidently Micah lived on a major thoroughfare and a logical stopping point, and they were camped there at his place. And these 5 spies said, do you know that in this house there's a real live priest here? An ephod and teraphim and a graven image and a molten image. You know, we've got a battle to fight. We're going to go up and conquer a city. We've got a battle to fight. You know, this guy's got a lot of religion here. He's got all these little idols and these little trinkets, and he's got all this stuff. You know, maybe we ought to take some of that along. Religion was sort of a good luck charm. You know, that's what Micah had thought. That was why he was so happy to have a Levite, you remember, as a priest. He says, now I know the Lord's going to do me good. Boy, God's going to take care of me. I really got religion. I got the real thing. I got a real Levite for a priest. That's what he had said back in Judges 17:13, you know. God was sort of a hip pocket God. You could put God in your pocket and He would get you out of a jam. You could worship God the way that seemed right to you and somehow have the trappings, the outer trappings of religion, and that was going to do it. Well, when they found out that there was a religious shrine here, in verse 15, they turned there, came to the house of the young man, the Levite, the house of Micaiah, and they saluted him. And the 600 men appointed with weapons of war stood by the entering of the gate. And the 5 men that went to spy out the land came in, and they came in there to take the idol, the graven image and the ephod and the teraphim and all these things. And the priest stood in the entering of the gate. He was standing there talking to the soldiers, and when these 5 spies went into Micah's house and fetched all these idols and all these trinkets, and the priest looked around and he saw that, and he said, what are you doing? You're stealing our religion. You're stealing our gods. You can't do that. And they said unto him, verse 19, shut up. Hold your peace. Lay your hand upon your mouth. And go with us. And be to us a father and a priest. It's better for you to be a priest unto the house of one man, or to be a priest unto a tribe and a family in Israel. And the priest's heart was glad. Oh boy, he was getting a promotion. Now he was really moving up. Now he had started to rebuke them for stealing, and they said, look, none of this rebuke stuff. You close your mouth, put your hand on your mouth. If you don't tell us anything we don't want to hear, you can go with us and we'll promote you. We'll hire you. You can be our priest. Now, wouldn't you rather be a priest to a whole tribe than just a priest to this fellow and his family? Oh, yeah. A tribe. Whole tribe, huh? I'll be the priest? Boy, that sounds pretty good. That's pretty impressive. Micah was a priest for hire. Micah could sort of alter his doctrine to suit whatever people wanted to hear. And if they told him to put his hand on his mouth and quit talking about something they didn't want to hear about, he was willing to oblige. He wasn't going to preach what they didn't want to hear. No, verse 20, the priest's heart was glad. And he took the ephod and the teraphim and the graven image and went in the midst of the people. Boy, he was ready to be their leader now. He was going to be their priest. So they turned and departed and put the little ones and the cattle and the carriage before them. And they were a good way from the house of Micah. The men in the houses near Micah's house gathered together, and they overtook the children of Dan. So Micah's neighbors, they got together an army, and they came down there, and they cried unto the children of Dan, and they turned their faces and said to Micah, what ails you? What are you coming after us with all this bunch? And he said, well, you've taken away my gods that I made. Those are my gods. I know they are because I made them. And that's my priest. And you're all gone away. And what have I more? Why, you've taken all my religion from me here. And what is this that you say unto me? What ails you? You know, what do you mean? What's wrong with me? You guys have been to my house and stole all my religious items. And the children of Dan said unto him, Let not your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows run upon you and you lose your life. Fella, you better get quiet in a hurry. We got some people over here. You know, an accident could befall you. Angry fellows. There's some of the guys here a little hot-headed, and if they keep hearing you run your mouth, they'll liable to kill you. You'll lose your life and the lives of your household. And the children of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his house. And they took the things which Micah had made, and the priests which he had, and went to Laish unto a people that were quiet and secure, and they smote them with the edge of the sword and burnt the city with fire. And there was nobody to deliver Laish. So they built a city. They called the name of the city, verse 29, they called the name of it Dan, after the city of Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born unto Israel. The name of the city was Laish at first. And the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. And they set them up Micah's graven image, which he had made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. Now, here you have the story. Here was a priest. He was for hire. He was willing to corrupt himself. Why? Money, prestige, sense of job security. He was willing to corrupt himself. Now, one of the interesting things that is not noticed from reading the King James, some of you with other translations may have a note in your margin, but the word is not Manasseh in the original text. Verse 30. The name in the original text is Moses. The Jews pointed the word in a certain way so that whenever they read it in the synagogue, they always read it as Manasseh. They were embarrassed on behalf of Moses that here was one of his immediate descendants who was that corrupt. Righteousness is not hereditary in the physical sense. Now here, we've looked just briefly at three specific examples. We see the example of Aaron and the golden calf. We see the corruption, the absolute paganism that came in because people were enticed and attracted to the old paganism they had left behind, because you see they never really left it behind in their hearts and minds. You see Nadab and Abihu, who were profane, careless men. They treated the service of God with disrespect. They thought that they could casually come before God and just do whatever they thought, whatever they chose. Do it in the way that was fine with them. They were not men of great, profound reverence and respect for God and the things of God. They were careless and profane individuals. And here we have a story, by the time we get on into the time of the Judges. We're told, you see, the setting of this is there was no king in Israel. Everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. People made religion to suit them. And they liked the trappings of the paganism around them. They didn't want to stand out and be that different from all the nations. They liked the festivals and the customs and all of the things that to them looked good, looked nice, looked attractive. Now, this young priest, this young Levite, was out of a job. He was looking for a place. And he found one. And he was willing to adjust his religion to suit whoever was paying his salary, whether it was one man or whether it was a whole tribe of men. He was for sale. Now, God had emphasized something for the Levites. The Levites had no inheritance in the Promised Land. Well, they had an inheritance. Back in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 44, in verse 27, God says, in the day that he goes into the sanctuary, under the inner court, to minister in the sanctuary, he shall offer the sin offering, says the Lord God, and it shall be unto them for an inheritance. I am their inheritance, and you shall give them no possession in Israel. I am their possession. They will eat of the meat offerings and the sin offerings and the trespass offerings, and every dedicated thing shall be theirs. I'm their inheritance. Now the Levite had fallen on hard times because you see the people had fallen away from the truth. And obviously one of the things that they had ceased doing early on was tithing. And so the Levite was on hard times. He was looking for a job. And he was willing to put his hand over his mouth and not say anything unpopular if that was what was necessary. The Danite said, you can come with us and you can be our priest. We'll give you a raise. But we don't want you telling us anything we don't want to hear. You put your hand on your mouth. And he did. He was not the kind of priest who would lift up his voice like a trumpet, cry aloud, and spare not, and show the people their sins. He could be bought. You see, when God is your inheritance, and you have nothing tangible that you can count on, you have to walk by faith. And this young man didn't have a whole lot of faith. So he looked, and he decided that what he needed to do was to find a way to sort of fit in. He would go along in order to get along. We see that there were major problems. There was corruption of the people because there was a corruption of those who should have been teaching the people and orienting the people to God. Notice earlier here in Ezekiel 44, in verse 23, they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and profane. It was interesting, that if you go through, it gives the instructions about the holy garments they were to wear in verse 19. In verse 20, it talks about right on down to their haircut. They're not to shave their heads nor allow their hair to grow long. They're to poll their heads. In other words, to clip their hair in a normal haircut. And neither were they to drink wine when they enter into the inner court. And in terms of marriage, they were to marry either a virgin of the house of Israel or a widow who had been married to a priest earlier. God allowed divorce because of the hardness of the hearts for the nation of Israel as a whole, but the priests were held to a higher standard of conduct than the people as a whole. Verse 23, why? They shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the profane and cause them to discern between the clean and the unclean. They were to set an example in every aspect. They were to point out by the way that they lived. And in controversy they shall stand in judgment, and they shall judge it according to my judgments, and they shall keep my laws and my statutes and my assemblies, and they shall hallow my Sabbaths. So here, speaking here of a Levitical priesthood, we have principles of what a priest was to do. And as we have just looked through in a summary account, priests were at the heart of corruption. that came in time and time again. Instead of teaching the people of God the difference between holy and profane, between clean and unclean, here were people corrupting themselves either because of pressure from people or because of just a careless and profane attitude toward life, or because of a lack of faith and a willingness to compromise and to sell themselves out. People will corrupt themselves for money, for prestige. This Levite in Judges 17 and 18 did. They'll corrupt themselves out of fear, as Aaron did. They'll corrupt themselves simply because of a careless and profane attitude toward life, a lack of reverence to God and the things of God, as did Nadab and Abihu. Now, this doesn't all just apply to the priests of ancient Israel, to the Levitical priesthood. And it doesn't simply apply to the ministry of God. It applies to every one of us in here, because what are we told back in 1 Peter chapter 2? 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, "You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of Him who has called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light." God has called us all to be a royal priesthood. What is it we're to do in the world that is to come? We read in Revelation chapter 20, in verse 6, "Blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with Him 1,000 years." Well, those that are in the first resurrection are to be priests. Priests of God and of Christ. We're told in Revelation 5:10 that we shall be kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. We're being called as a royal priesthood. God is calling a priesthood that will not corrupt itself, either out of fear or out of carelessness and negligence, a lack of reverence and respect for God and the things of God, not out of seeking material advantage and seeking to advance themselves just on the human level. God is calling and working with individuals to serve as His priests, who recognize that real security is from the eternal, that God is our inheritance. That's our real security. That's what God wanted the Levites to understand. Their security rested with God. We're being called as a royal priesthood, a holy nation, called out to show forth the praises of Him who's called us out of the darkness and into His marvelous light. We're preparing that we might teach the nations the difference between the holy and the profane, between the clean and the unclean. We're learning those things and inculcating them into our lives, a relationship with God and walking with God, as we are putting things into practice in our lives. As we look through these examples, it's important that we take note and take heed. The Apostle Paul writes that in the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In verse 1 of chapter 10, he said, "Now, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. Were baptized unto Moses, did all eat the same spiritual meat, drink the same spiritual rock. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. He was the rock of Israel. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1. "For the scripture saith, He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that hath ears, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. With many of them God was not well pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. These things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. On down in verse 11, all these things happened unto them for examples, and are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. These examples and these illustrations are not just a matter of dead history. They are examples for us as the people of God. We can look and see reasons why people corrupted themselves. God is developing a priesthood that will be an incorruptible priesthood, because it is a priesthood that is developing His character within them, that is yielding to Him, that is being called out of this world and is responding to that call. A priesthood that God is in the process of preparing here and now. Blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death will have no power. They'll be kings. They'll be priests of God and of Christ. They'll reign with Him for 1,000 years. Brethren, you and I are being prepared to serve as a part of that priesthood. And as we look at these examples and these illustrations, we need to take heed, to realize the things that have been the undoing of those in the past. And God is preparing us that we've come to a point where we have come to reject those things that were the corrupting influence. We've got to learn to worship God in spirit and in truth, to walk with God and to yield to God, to have an attitude of faith in God and reliance upon God, not an attitude of compromise with the corruption of society around. God is preparing an acceptable priesthood, a holy priesthood. You and I have been called to be a part of that. And as we look to value our calling, to learn from these examples, that we might be a part of that holy priesthood unto our God.